Hello and welcome to Found, TechCrunch's podcast that brings you the stories behind the startups. I'm your host, Becca Szkutak, and this week we're doing something a little different. We're bringing you a conversation about a little something you may have heard of called AI and what policy and regulation could look like for that industry. Last month, I got the chance to chat with Helen Toner about the very subject. Toner is the Director of Strategy and Foundational Research Grants at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, but you might know her a little bit better as a former board member at OpenAI. While she's not a founder herself, this conversation did center around topics that are crucial for founders to think about today, especially as AI becomes part of every company in some way. So let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Helen. Perfect. Well, we've got a lot to talk about today. Similar topics to what we've already been kind of chatting with other guests, AI regulation, say that 5 times fast, and policy. But I think one question to start that I've been wanting to ask you in particular for no specific reason, can a company regulate itself when it comes to AI?
I mean, it's a bit of a setup, isn't it? I wrote in The Economist a couple of weeks ago that I think the answer is essentially no. And I think especially for AI companies that are aiming to build extremely advanced AI technology, so not just, a particular app for a particular sector, but companies that are aiming to build artificial general intelligence, as they call it, or otherwise really seeking to build highly general purpose, highly powerful technologies. I think that is a really ambitious endeavor and one that deserves a lot of scrutiny and one that it deserves a lot of participation and engagement from a broad range of stakeholders. And I think that is an idea that is becoming more and more intuitive and widespread, and I'm glad to see that.
And just before we dive in further, taking a step back, because I know reading the headlines, reading what different companies are doing and what different companies are getting slaps on the wrist for, what other companies are seemingly getting away with, getting sued with, it's made me think time and time again, is there any regulation on AI currently? Like, what does regulation look like, if any? Is there any policy this stuff falls under, or is there we're starting fresh?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of regulation that already applies to AI, including, some that Chair Khan just spoke about. But often it's regulation that applies much more broadly. And if you build something with AI, then it still applies. I think actually the FTC has said, there's no AI exception to existing laws. So, in addition to the kinds of false advertising or deceptive practices that the FTC would look at, you also have all kinds of sector-based regulation. So if you're building AI for healthcare, for transportation, for finance, we have existing sectoral regulators that have rules for what's okay and what's not okay in those spaces. And in many cases, AI systems will be covered by those existing rules. Sometimes it's not a perfect fit, so you can get into kind of the policy nitty-gritty of, what investigative powers do they have, or, which actor can be penalized for which kinds of behaviors. But by and large, I would say there's plenty of regulation, primarily on a sector-by-sector basis, that certainly already applies to AI.
That's so interesting to hear because you obviously know this. A lot of people in the room know this. When you start talking about regulation, when it comes to AI, it's like you brought up the boogeyman. It's like you brought up Voldemort. It's like founders don't talk about it, VCs don't want to talk about it, companies don't want to talk about it. And yet there's regulation that a lot of these companies already have to deal with, or sort of guidelines they have to follow anyway. So why are people so afraid of potential regulation? And why is some of that fear potentially a little misguided?
I think some of the fear is not misguided. I think there are plenty of places where you can see regulations really going awry or being too heavy-handed. I think, for example, there's a whole thing in the discourse right now around, or at least on my Twitter feed, I don't know what your all Twitter feeds look like, around the green transition and green energy and the ways that some of those potential projects you might want to invest in are being held up by environmental reviews. And so, you're obliged to go through this multi-year, sometimes multi-decade process to do an environmental review. And if you're doing that for a giant solar farm and the solar farm gets delayed or canceled because of, a particular species of lizard, I don't know, maybe that wasn't actually kind of a net win for society. So I think it makes sense that people kind of have some trepidation, and especially some of the kind of big picture or the short versions of policy ideas that sometimes get thrown around for AI can sound kind of heavy-handed and a lot. But I think with a lot of things in policy, it really depends on the details. It really depends on the specifics. And I think sometimes the headline level conversation about AI policy can turn into a big thing of, there's regulation versus innovation, and you have to do not too much and not too little, as opposed to looking at actually there's all kinds of different ways that government can be involved. Also that you can have other forms of soft governance, not just hard law, whether that be industry arrangements or kind of mechanisms you could have between different trade organizations or industry standards there's really a lot of options, really big option space here. And so I think, while on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to not wanting poorly designed or heavy-handed regulation, at the same time, I do think the sort of immediate jump scare at any involvement by government of any kind is not really appropriate.
And what you just talked about there, all the different ways there could be regulation that isn't super heavy-handed, reminded me of something we talked about last week when we were chatting about this in preparation for tonight. You were saying that regulation is a spectrum. It's not just, it's one end or the other, and there's just so much in between of where it can end up falling in the future. How can AI companies today or people in the AI space work with the government and work with these organizations to ensure that the regulations that do come in the future kind of work for both sides? How can AI companies get directly involved as opposed to, say, waiting for stuff to come out and just saying if they like it or not?
Yeah, I think seconding what Steve was saying at the beginning of the evening, I think it's really valuable to be involved in conversations, to be talking with folks on the Hill, also in the executive branch. I think most of the room is based in DC, so I'm sure that this is something that's familiar for you. The policy world works in large part on the basis of relationships and trust. And there's a lot of judgment calls that need to be made. And so if you can be in some of those rooms and talking to people about what are the technical realities of the work that you do or the work that companies you fund do, I think making sure that there's that tight coupling between what is some bill in Congress trying to achieve and what is it in practice going to do? Are there going to be unintended effects because they didn't realize that some definition actually brings in a bunch of stuff they didn't mean, or other things like that? So I think thinking of it as a productive collaboration between different people with different kinds of expertise and bringing the expertise that you have is really valuable. I think thinking of it as either something to kind of ignore or as sort of an adversarial fight where you have to be kind of trying to get the other side to do as little as possible, I think will be less productive. I also think it's worth really thinking about the different ways that this could play out, especially if, right now we're coming off the back of a few years, maybe, a decade or so of AI continually getting more sophisticated, more powerful, more capable, more widely used. And I think in a lot of ways, to me, the default is Congress right now, I don't know if anyone's noticed, not super functional, not super good at passing laws, unless there's a massive crisis. And I think one thing that I sometimes wonder about is whether people who are trying to, minimize the chance that there's any AI regulation now, whether they're thinking through the fact that if, in fact, there's nothing passed and nothing passed and nothing passed and nothing passed, and then something happens with AI, which at some point it will, it's going to be a big, powerful technology, something will go wrong at some point. If the only laws that we're getting are being made in a knee-jerk way in reaction to a big crisis, is that going to be productive? Because that is the default path is, nothing, nothing, nothing until there's a giant crisis and then a knee-jerk reaction. And so I think some of the sort of smarter and more thoughtful actors that I've seen in this space are trying to say, okay, what are the pretty light touch, pretty common sense guardrails we can put in place now to make future crises, future big problems less likely, less severe, and basically make it less likely that you end up with the need for some kind of rapid and poorly thought through response later, which in some ways I think, again, is the default given how bad Congress is at legislating right now.
More from this conversation right after a quick break.
And I know a couple of weeks ago with OpenAI kind of running into that issue with Scarlett Johansson and did they use her voice? Did they not? We're not sure. Of course, there's a lot of incriminating evidence, but we're not sure. We're not sure. But when people were talking about using that as an example of why we should have clearer regulation around stuff like this so that people don't make these mistakes, I was reading a lot of comments on Twitter, and these were from real people, some of them even being VCs I've interviewed in the past, not bots. And they were like, well, every other sector, we've just moved fast and break things. Why does it matter so much in this case that this is now wrong? Oh, Facebook did that. Was that wrong? Which now we know years later that was wrong. But at the time, it was that wasn't wrong. Why is it wrong if AI companies move fast and break things?
I think some amount of that is right. I think you don't want to be trying to predict the future too much. And in many cases, waiting until there's a problem so you can know what problem you're trying to solve is very reasonable. Again, I do think there's a bit of an exception for the very small number of companies that are trying to build extremely advanced AI systems, telling you we're going to build human-level AI, superhuman-level AI, we're going to do it in the next 5 years. That's a pretty different kind of pitch for your company than, that book of faces that your university gives you, we're going to do a digital version of that. That's kind of a different thing. So I think it's kind of reasonable for the public, for government, for sort of society at large to look at those companies and be like, okay, you want us to trust you. Why should we trust you? Convince us that we should trust you. And I think the different companies have somewhat mixed track record over time of earning that trust. And I think that the importance of having that trust and earning that trust is only going to go up again if the sophistication of the technology keeps improving.
Definitely. And I know a lot of the conversation around AI policy and regulation has focused on like the big names that we all know that are already established in the space, like the Microsofts, the Googles, and the OpenAIs. But of course, we're in a room with VCs and startups, and there are a lot of startups trying to break into the space. Either they're looking to build a large language model up from the ground themselves, or they're looking to sort of build technology off of, say, OpenAI's model as well. How can they think about not just the regulation of today, but potential regulation that actually seems realistic for the future, so that if they're kind of just getting started, they're making sure they're not building in a way where they could have more problems down the line if regulation goes into place than if they had, say, gone the other fork in the road? How can startups think about those kind of things, even though they haven't come into effect yet?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts here. I think one is to be very deliberate and intentional about your choice of sector and use case. A huge problem with talking about regulating AI is that AI can be anything. AI can be in literally any sector you can imagine. So I think there is a real difference if you're using AI to do elder care versus using AI to recommend videos or build a Spotify playlist. There's a real difference in the level of scrutiny that you should expect to be applied to your product. And I think that's not to say that no one should build in those kind of higher scrutiny, higher regulation sectors. There are often some really, really important sectors. But if you're going to be in a sector like that, you just are going to have to be very thoughtful from the beginning with things like documentation, I think is really important if you're in a place where you think you might down the road be subject to any kind of regulation because you're in a kind of higher risk, higher impact sector. Keeping track of what are you training? How are you training it? How are you testing it? What are you doing with your data? How are you updating it? Which models you have deployed and which products at which time. The stories you hear from people who've been on the inside of some of these big companies is they often, even like really big, really respected companies, is they often don't even have good records of like, oh, wait, hang on, which combination of models is running that particular product right now? So I think those would, be two suggestions that would come to mind for me. First, be thoughtful about the sector you're going into and what level of scrutiny you should expect there. And second, if there might be scrutiny, then think of documentation as kind of your first line of defense and just having well-kept records about what you're doing.
And I know it came up in both the conversation with Steve as well as with Lena Khan also, but startups have different resources than Microsoft. We all know that. So it's like thinking of being a part of the AI conversation. How can smaller companies with less resources make sure that they too can work into this conversation and they too can kind of map out the potential regulation policies that affects them as well, even if they don't have as deep of pockets to kind of influence where it goes?
Yeah, I think it comes back to those relationships, to being available, to being interested for policymakers. Often from the perspective of policymakers, they know that they don't understand the technology and they really want to be able to talk to people who do. But it's hard to know who that would be. Often the easiest people to find are, a friendly neighborhood lobbyist. So if you can be there, if you can go to events, if you can kind of strike up a conversation, I don't know if there's a better way than that. I mean, and then of course there would be other things like joining groups, being part of communities like this, which let you also kind of be part of something larger as a collection of sort of smaller actors, I think can also be valuable.
And I know the election, again, has come up in all of these sessions so far, but we all talked about it. We all do know it's election year. And similar to what I mentioned with Steve, of course, who wins president will have an impact on things like this. But almost more so, it's who gets voted into the House, who gets voted into the Senate. From the states, maybe you're thinking California, thinking New York, maybe from the states that don't come to mind when you think of AI. What should we expect from this election? Not necessarily in terms of who's going to win, but does it even have the opportunity to potentially speed up regulation? Do you think it's going to be more of the same? Like, how do you think this year could end up impacting, say, the conversations we're having around this next year?
Yeah, so I tend to think about this a lot from the perspective of the space that I mostly work in, which is more the national security, foreign affairs space. And one effect that people noticed from the last, 8 years, which I think is going to be relevant for the next term, whichever kind of president it turns out to be, is that, a potential Trump presidency is just going to be much more unpredictable, much more erratic than a Biden presidency. In many ways, the sort of mainline policies may not be that different necessarily, depending on the issue. But I think the sort of process and regularity and predictability of the Biden years has just been much greater than what we saw under Trump. And so I think sort of expect the unexpected if we do see a second Trump term. And then a second big thing that I'm keeping an eye on is, as you mentioned, not just the presidential level, but kind of in Congress more broadly. I mean, essentially, the way I think about it is how functional is Congress? How able to do its job is it? A friend of mine who spent many years on the Hill told me that he thinks the House is currently more dysfunctional than it's been since the Civil War. So that's like, a big claim. So, does that worsen in the next Congress? Does that potentially improve a little bit? There's been this whole big process run by Leader Schumer in the Senate around, running these insight forums about AI. I'm sure many of you followed them, writing up a whole big report about the findings of that. Does that kind of get carried over? Is that an initial setup for Congress to step in and build on that and make laws and kind of carry things forward? Or does that folder get dropped on the ground and lost in the shuffle and we're starting from scratch? And I think that will be partly a result of which parties are in control, but also a result of the kinds of members and senators that we get. Do we have as chaotic a speaker election and speaker continuation as we've had this time around? And of course, what other priorities do they choose to pick up? So those are, I think, kind of the two big things that I'm watching.
And thinking about past areas that we have been slow to regulate on, things like social media, things like crypto. I know you talked to crypto founders today. They're still not 100% sure exactly where regulation is going regarding their field either. Do you think AI will be different? Like, will history repeat itself? Will the future government sort of wait too long? Or as you mentioned earlier, wait until something happens to really decide to take a stand or really decide to fix the issue? Or do you think we've learned from that? Do you think we'll see regulation, maybe not soon, but maybe a little earlier than we have in the past? Like, is now any different than some of the past, like, tech crazes that have come in that we've then kind of tried to figure out as they're happening?
To be honest, I think everyone says that they've learned and then they don't seem to act very differently. So if I had to bet, I would bet that we'll probably see something similar, and also similar in as much as, Europe has passed major AI legislation. I'm sure plenty of people in the room are thinking about the European market and what compliance with the AI Act is going to look like, not to mention the Digital Market Act, the Digital Services Act. It may well be that where things go with AI mirrors where they've gone with something like data privacy, where there's actually quite different rules in place in different jurisdictions. In consumer privacy, we saw California eventually passing pretty significant legislation. So there's also a question, would that dynamic repeat itself here? I think there's a lot of ways it could go. I do think it will depend what happens with the technology. If we do see things continuing to ramp up and accelerate and more concern about increasingly powerful AI systems versus if, as some other experts believe, things sort of plateau and there's not that much new exciting stuff happening over the next 5 years, I think that will affect where things go. But yeah, if I had to put money on it, I would probably put money on there not being enormous new changes at the federal level. And then it's just a question of what else might happen around the edges.
And we just have time for one last question. I'm just curious, with everything that we've talked about so far and sort of all the experiences you've had working with both OpenAI and some of the other companies you work with through the work that you're doing now, are you optimistic we're going to get it right?
My overall picture with AI policy, and my answer to this question as well, is just huge uncertainty. And I think anyone who is sure one way or another, sure that things are going to go fast or that they're going to be really slow, sure that they're going to be amazing or terrible, I think it's misguided to have a ton of confidence either way. So I think there's a really wide range of potential futures. And in one way, it's going to be very exciting to get to see where things go. Hopefully it's just exciting and not, not scary or bad. But I think we should take seriously the possibility that there's just a very wide range of ways that the future could play out from here.
Definitely. No, join me in thanking Helen.
Found is hosted by myself, TechCrunch senior reporter Becca Szkutak, alongside senior reporter Dominic Midori-Davis. Found is produced by Maggie Stamets with editing by Kel. Our illustrator is Bryce Durbin. Found's audience development and social media is managed by Morgan Little, Alyssa Stringer, and Natalie Kreisman. TechCrunch's audio products are managed by Henry Pickavet. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week.